So welcome to our second live stream of sorts. Joining me again is my lovely wife, Janet. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to go over a few things that are happening in the news, talk a little bit more about mask mandates and just sort of what's been going on kind of in our society in this moment. I appreciate the comments that many of you have shared in these past videos, and we're going to be touching on a few of those coming up. But first, I thought we'd go over some headlines that we've discussed off camera a little bit anyway. And one thing we didn't discuss, and that is why I read the CBC. Have we talked about that before? I don't know if we have.
Not on camera.
Not
you
on
and
camera?
I have talked about
Okay.
it, but
And people, I mean, some of you have pointed this out, like why, like sometimes I rail on CBC and I talk about many of the problems they have, and some people say, well, why do you even bother? Like, of course it's crazy, why are you even bothering to look at them? And I guess there's a few reasons. One, I like to see kind of what our official state broadcaster has to say. I think it gives some insight as to what some people are thinking or trying to get other people to think. But another reason that we don't talk about so much is if, for example, the CBC generally is on opposite sides of things than me personally. Mm-hmm. So when, I don't call them my enemy exactly, but the adversary, when one's adversary even agrees with something, it kind of lends, like if even the CBC says such and such, it kind of shows just how beyond the pale it is. If you think like different people like the room temperature at different temperatures. So like I generally prefer a little bit cooler, you generally prefer a little bit warmer, nice and warm by the fire, by the way. So if even you think it's hot, where I generally am sensitive to hot before you are, then I must really, really find it's hot. So I think the CBC can act as a bit of a barometer to kind of, you know, if even the CBC is saying this, it says something.
can I add to
Yeah,
that?
of course.
I was just going to say, often, I mean, one of my frustrations the last couple of years has been that a lot of the people that I love and care for that don't agree with my thinking on these issues such as personal freedoms and things aren't listening to the same news that I am. And I think if we expect others to expand their minds and maybe look at other news sources that maybe they wouldn't normally like to watch, or I think it's healthy for everyone to kind of check out news that maybe disagrees with them, because it helps us to think through things. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah,
Yeah.
see what, you know, and yeah, go through the exercise. Even if you see something and viscerally think, this is wrong, to go through the intellectual exercise of trying to figure out like how and where they got it wrong. Mm-hmm. And I guess the other thing that goes along with that is, as much as people tend to malign their opponent in this day and age, especially on social media, inevitably, like even sort of our adversaries, they say things that are right as well. Mm-hmm. Usually there's faulty reasoning or different assumptions, but you know, sometimes they get some things right, and it's fair to point those out. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this headline, this first one, just noticed it today. In fairness, I haven't read the whole article. I gave it a quick scan. But the headline is, Iranian Canadians say they are being punished with travel restrictions for being conscripted as young men. So just by a little bit of background here, as I kind of read it, I guess some of these Iranian Canadians served in the Iranian military. I can't remember, it's got the Republican Guard, that I guess the U.S. has deemed a terrorist organization, and because these Iranian Canadians, when they were young men, were technically part of this, as I think they were conscripted, so I get the impression they didn't have a choice,
Right.
that they can't fly to the U.S.
And just to be clear, the U.S. only declared that a terrorist organization, like when?
That's a good question. I didn't notice that. Is that in the article?
I thought it was. But
Presumably it's somewhat recently. Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
it's not
yeah.
like they decided like when these kids were in this organization that it was a terrorist organization. It's somewhat recent.
Yeah, I assume the fact that this is news, I assume that maybe something's changed, but perhaps not. I don't know. But the thing that sort of struck me about this is all of a sudden the CBC seems concerned about, and let me just say, like, I don't know all the background here, so I think it's worth looking into. Like, if someone it raises some interesting questions. If someone was conscripted as a very young person and didn't really have a choice to join an organization, even if that organization is technically a terrorist organization, and if someone has denounced that and or moved away and or has been separated by decades, is it reasonable to, infringe on the freedom? Those are good questions, ones that I'm not going to say one way or the other. It's certainly probably complicated and nuanced, but I find it interesting that the CBC seems concerned with people not having the freedom to travel.
Right.
They even use the term travel restrictions, which sounds familiar. I feel like we've heard that before.
Maybe just a little.
Yeah. And I find it just a little rich coming from the CBC that, we talked about this the other day, I'm losing my time in terms of when restrictions ended, let's say roughly I guess it was the vax mandate, but at least a year, should we say, year and a half, where unvaccinated people couldn't get on an airplane. Is that roughly correct?
Yep.
And those are Canadians with no allegations of being part of a terrorist organization.
Right.
This is about whether or not they took medicine. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, it says too, like this first line, it says, Iranian Canadians say they're being treated as second-class citizens.
Yeah.
So now we're kind of basically, in this article, we're kind of admitting that by not being able to travel, one is kind of a second-class citizen.
Yeah.
And in fact, this isn't even about travel within Canada between our own provinces and things like that. This is, if you can't travel to another country, to the States, then you're a second-class citizen. How much greater would that be if you couldn't even get on a bus or a train?
That's a great point. Yeah, I didn't even think of that. You're right. That's, if some other country says, like, they don't like what we're doing, that might suck, but that's kind of the business of the other country, for better or worse. Here, right, yeah. It was the Canadian government that didn't let Canadians travel within Canada if they didn't take their medicine, which is interesting. What else do we have? This is another one. This is by Adam Miller. It came out a couple days ago, November 19th. And the headline is Why Mask Mandates May Be Harder to Justify in Solving the Crisis in Children's Hospitals. This struck me for a couple of reasons. One, there's a few things here. This is one of the CBC's sort of funny categories of news. It's called Second Opinion. They've got like first person, they've got analysis, these little, that are basically opinion pieces. They're not news. Anyway, that's maybe beside the point. But there's a lot of that at CBC, which I take some issue with. And Adam Miller he's written a lot about the pandemic. Up until very recently, I'd say he's been just trumpeting the mainstream media narrative. So this struck me because, at least on the surface, and frankly, and I did read this article, it's in its entirety the other day, he is actually taking a more nuanced approach, that maybe things aren't so cut and dried about whether these masks really work or to what degree they work, or whether RSV, like whether masking will help RSV. So I don't know what this means. Like, is the CBC starting to let go of that narrative that they once held? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
But interesting that, and again, I find it funny that the CBC, that has been, like, along with the other mainstream media, just at the forefront of lockdowns and restrictions and masks. So I guess this is where my earlier point comes in. Even the CBC is saying, well, it's maybe not so clear. So if the CBC is saying that, that's not Rebel News, that's not True North, that's not the Western Standard, that's not some kooky blog somewhere. This is the CBC, and even they're saying maybe these mask mandates aren't doing what we think they are, which makes one wonder, what business does University of Waterloo have in requiring this of their fully grown students, staff, and faculty?
Yeah, some people are still taking this very seriously. Like, there's still some people out there who really think that we should all be masked all the time. But it seems like there's another voice now. There's another group of people who are at least acknowledging that there was some damage done by wearing masks. Like, and I mean, at the beginning of COVID, we didn't know a lot of these things, so we can't be. I guess if we didn't know, we didn't know. But once we do have new information, we should be working with that new information. So I don't know. I understand, like, I do think our blue masks, from what I understand, do protect against the flu and cold. But just because they work against the flu and cold doesn't necessarily mean that we should have to wear them all the time.
Yeah.
Because as we know now, like children not being able to see faces has long-term negative effects on development. It seems to have had negative effects on some of our our natural immunities against just regular cold and flu and disease. I don't think people should not be allowed to wear masks. I think some people will want to wear them or have comorbidities or things that they might be nervous about. But anyway, I'm just happy that there are voices out there that seem to be preventing the mandate. Anyway, there's still a lot of voices out there saying you should wear a mask, and was it Dr. Uni?
Yeah, Peter Uni, yeah.
That said, that gave the advice that we should be wearing. He heavily recommends
no, not Peter
that?
Uni. That is actually who we're going to talk about next. So that's the Dr. Kieran Moore, the Ontario top dog. Can't remember his official title. Ontario's top doctor seen. Yeah, so this is the story from the CBC. So a few days ago, he was strongly recommending Ontarians wear masks, and then a few days after that, he's seen at a public event. So that the headline with CBC is Ontario's top doctor seen unmasked at event days after strongly recommending masking. And there's a picture of him in a crowd without a mask. So that's who you're referring to?
Yes, that's who I was thinking of.
And I find this interesting. I mean, there's a lot of people that are calling him a hypocrite, and I guess, frankly, his actions don't seem to be lining up with his words. I think this shows a few things. One, that I don't know. I've never met the man. This is, conjecture on my part, but we have these two Dr. Moores, it seems. We have the Dr. Moore who stands at the lectern and with a very sober face, issues these dire warnings. And then we've got this Dr. Moore who's at sort of like a social event. I'm not sure what this was. He's got what looks like a cocktail in his hand. There's someone singing. People are holding up their phones. It looks like he's smiling. He seems to be it's kind of festive, I'd say. He seems kind of relaxed.
It's a Toronto Life event.
It's a Toronto Life event. My sense is what we're seeing here. These are just two snapshots. Never met the man. This is closer to maybe the real Dr. Kieran Moore, I would suspect. So I think it has more to do with governments feeling pressured by whomever or whatever to issue these strong warnings. And I don't know if this is indeed what happened, but it seems like whether you start with the government or the media or both, there's a lot of energy spent getting people riled up over masks. And maybe the thinking was, if we don't get people really kind of worked up into a lather, they might not follow these mandates. So we really have to sort of pour it on pretty thick.
Right.
And working in human resources, I've been part of campaigns that sort of do that. You really kind of have to, because the tendency for people is to discount things. So you have to kind of maybe play it up a little bit.
Convince people.
Yeah. But what I think maybe has happened is they've worked so many people up into a lather that those same people are not willing to de-escalate themselves. That they, the media and the government have kind of created, perhaps arguably, some of this, this lather among people.
Well, there's fear too. Like we've lived kind of in this society of fear for 2 years now, where, you know, it started as a fear of COVID, and then basically by the government's efforts, we began to fear each other and fear touching and fear, you know, the air that you're breathing, and fear, you know, other people's maybe not washing their hands or using sanitizer or wearing the right mask. Or so we've been basically groomed to be fearful for the last 2 years, and we still, I don't know, it's hard to tell people that, okay, like, the emergency that caused us all to be really fearful is now kind of dying down, so everybody just relax, like we can stop being quite so fearful now. But I think in like you said, in working people up to that fear, now we're continuing to be fearful about, now it seems like we're fearful of this flu that's crowding our hospitals. So now we were conditioned to be fearful about COVID. We're still on high alert. So now the flu is a problem. So now we have to be fearful about the flu and put those masks back on. And then, you know, we have to be fearful of our kids going to school and getting sick, and we have to be fearful of all these things. And I think we understand that the fear that we've had is not healthy for us. Like it's been detrimental to many parts of us as humans. Like, but yeah, it's I think that fear is just seeping into other areas now.
For sure. Now, Janet, as you know, I'm not licensed to practice medicine in Ontario. But what I understand, like what stress is, like in the individual human, is it's that fight or flight response, that fear response, where there's something out there that's going to get us, or there's some imminent danger, and our body reacts a certain way to get us out of that danger quickly. And the body pays a cost, because I guess the idea, if a bear's chasing you down, you need that extra burst of energy to get up a tree or fight it off or whatever you have to do. So it's important for your survival that you be able to do that, but your body pays a cost for that. Now, I guess in sort of a natural environment, people's stress responses, and you see this with like prey animals, like when you see deer, they get startled and like they think their life is in danger, and I guess at some level it is, and then they can quickly de-escalate and just start munching on branches again. It's kind of amazing to see. But that idea of like staying in that state of fear, you know, causes damage to the human body. And I wonder, when we as a society stay in a state of fear for too long, like what's that doing for us? As you said, like early in the pandemic, like frankly, those first couple of weeks, if, you know, the government sort of comes on the airways and says, listen, something scary is happening, I'm not sure what it is, like please stay in your homes for a few days, like, yeah, I'll do that. Like that's sure, if it's short and
we're just trying to figure things out.
There's, you know, God forbid, an active shooter in the area, there's some imminent danger, and we suggest you, like, you know, gather your family, stay indoors and stay tuned. Like, okay, like I'm not such a freedom-loving person that I'm going to go keep living my life normally. I'll respond to that. But it's no way to live, like you just can't live that way.
It's not a permanent way to live. And I mean, I guess there are societies out there in the world who are living in fear, and we as Canadians would look at them and say that's not healthy for them. Like that's why we allow immigration from some of these countries, is because we all agree that having to live in fear of being conscripted to a gang or something is not
the way to live.
A way to live. So anyway, this thing about Moore, I just think it is interesting that even Dr. Moore, who's saying that, who's giving a heavy warning, you know, that we should all be wearing masks, to some degree, obviously believes that there's some discretion to be used by each person.
Clearly.
You know, maybe Dr. Moore would be wearing his mask if he were in a hospital right in that picture, or if he were, you know, I don't know. There's just, I could see that there might be circumstances where maybe he did feel that wearing a mask would be appropriate, but clearly at this, looks like it might even be outdoors. I don't know. Could be outdoors or maybe it's indoors. Anyway. In this circumstance, at this party, in a social setting where presumably, you know, it's a time to have fun, a time to gather, he doesn't see the need to wear a mask.
Yeah, if he was in like a really dangerous environment like the University of Waterloo, I'm sure he would happily don a mask to give a lecture there.
Right, yeah.
Let's have a look at some of the comments that we've received. First one is from, I just thought we would touch on a few. Thank you guys for commenting, by the way. I do appreciate it. Gives us food for thought. Actually, that's a good sort of tie into this first one by, I'm assuming it's a he, but I don't know. His name is Wahlet. And he commented on my video about whether masks are a religious symbol. I think that's the video. And he makes some comments about the video, but then he adds this, which I particularly appreciate. He writes, on your video productions, I suspect the long form is what suits you best. I noticed in both this and the last video with your wife, you commented at some point that you felt you were going over time, and yet then after that point, some of what I consider your best thoughts came out. Unless you really feel the need to keep it in a time frame, and maybe other viewers as well, I would suggest just to speak what needs to be said till you are done. So I appreciate the input on sort of what we're doing here, because frankly we're still kind of finding our way, but it seems to be meeting some kind of need. You guys are commenting, you guys are watching, and frankly it meets like a need that I have, that we have, to sort of work some of this stuff out in dialogue between Jan and me, and with you as well. So I appreciate that comment, and we'll see, maybe we'll try this longer format to see how it goes. Next comment here, also on our religious masks, our COVID masks are religious symbol. This fellow named Bob Fraser writes a fairly long comment, which I appreciate. I'm going to read part of it. He writes, we all have convictions. Sometimes following certain convictions are a no-brainer. Other times we wrestle with convictions and are faced with very difficult decisions and associated consequences. I appreciate your reference to the idea that we don't necessarily choose our convictions. I believe you're onto something. How we arrive at our convictions can be complex, to say the least, and we could have a separate discussion about that entirely. Regardless, there are times when we are faced with a conviction where we have to decide if it is a mountain I'm willing to die on. Most of the time, thankfully, the word die is figurative. More, there are serious consequences to following those convictions. In my experience, these defining moments are very individual. If we don't necessarily choose these convictions, then presumably they are chosen for us. I believe that ultimately God is the one who convicts. He doesn't create us all the same and treats us as individuals. As such, while some of us may share similar convictions, even the level of our convictions may differ from others. We all have to ask if God is asking us if this conviction is one of those mountains he wants us to climb. So what do you think of this Bob Fraser guy?
Well, he's my dad, so I love him. He's great. So, but we don't agree on everything. Yeah. So, but I do agree with him here. I think that's very true. And I think when we were talking about this before taping this, we were talking about how the world needs different people to have different convictions in order to go about different things. Like, I'm just thinking, like, I'm thinking about foster care. Like, we happened to do foster care for many years, and that was something I felt convicted to do when our kids were young. Like, I don't know, I learned about it and I just felt like this is something I need to do, and you agreed with me and we went about and did it. That's not something that everyone feels convicted to do, nor should everyone feel convicted to do that thing. Like, if we expected everyone to be foster parents, like, we'd have some really crappy foster parents out there and who just aren't passionate about it. And yet those same people might be like excellent at different things that they feel particularly convicted about. Like, everybody kind of has their way of contributing to
and there's
the world.
That sort of, not a fine line, but using foster care as a great example, is, you know, if one says, I feel that doing foster care is important and I'm going to make sacrifices in my life to do this, although it would be a little unusual using foster care as an example, but one might hear that and choose to hear that, oh, if I don't do foster care, there must be something wrong with me.
Right.
Or I'm not as morally good, or
Right.
that. And I think that's a problem. And I think that's been a problem with our discourse about mask wearing and vaccines is, you know, if I say I'm not prepared to take a vaccine, what other people might hear is anyone who takes a vaccine is wrong.
Right.
And those are different things. They're similar, they might be related. They both could be true. One could be true and not the other. So having that nuance to understand that individuals are called to different things. So yeah, I think Dad, you did a great job articulating that. Is something that I think is important, is to understand that people can have sincerely held convictions, even if we don't happen to share those. We should at least affirm those people who want to follow through on their convictions, assuming those things are moral and good and right. We use the example, like there's, using sort of a Christian context, there's some people that feel called to be missionaries, to go overseas, to work in hospitals, to dig wells, to do different things, and it's great that there are people to do that. I don't think everyone is called to do that. Mm-hmm. You know, we were talking, there was a family that we knew at a former church who happened to do well at business, and you know, they had financial resources and they were very generous, and they would bless people through employment and through other things that people who didn't have those financial means couldn't do. Now, if everyone was called to make money and give it away, it wouldn't be necessary, because I guess we'd all have money. Some people feel convicted to, you know, maybe make financial sacrifices to do certain things, but not everyone can and should do that. So thanks, Dad, for pointing that out. I think that's
I think the other thing that just came to mind was that just because one has a conviction or believes something is good doesn't necessarily mean that they're being called to die for it.
That's true too. Yeah, that's, yeah.
You might, I mean, there are people who are out there who would prefer not to wear a mask, and they have their ideas about that, but they don't want to get on YouTube and talk about why or anything like that, and that's okay too. Like that's the mountain you're willing to die on, or feeling that you're called to die on, is like not everything you believe has to be something you go shout on on the rooftop.
Yeah, I think it was the Tragically Hip's Gord Downey, who one of the lyrics basically says that he likes martyrs, but he enjoys them vicariously. Something to that effect, which is a good way to enjoy martyrs, I suppose.
Right.
So yeah, thanks for that thoughtful comment. We appreciate that. Next one is from someone named Bibi Burns. And I don't know if that's a man or a woman. I'm going to use feminine pronouns. I think it might be a woman. If not, I apologize. And this was on my video about doing a COVID review, like reviewing our response to it. And I just want to say a few things about this. First of all, I guess Bibi doesn't agree with me. And I just want to say first and foremost that I welcome people who disagree with me. I thought she, made her comments well, and she didn't seem angry or full of vitriol or anything, that she seemed to, from what I can tell, honestly sort of engage in a discussion, which I think is great. And that's something I think is important to this channel, or it's important to me, is I don't want to just be a group of people who all agree with one another, just agreeing with one another all day. So I want to be challenged. I don't have all the answers. You guys don't have all the answers, but I think it's through that discourse that we can sort of get better, or sort of have a better understanding of sort of what's going on in the world. Anyway, I won't get too much into it other than to say I do appreciate that she took a dissenting view. Her view was we should put our faith in the experts, that if the experts tell us something is safe and effective, then we should believe it. And I asked her, I said, well, what do you, Bibi, think makes for an effective vaccine? And I'm paraphrasing her answer was, well, I don't know. I'm not an infectious disease expert. What I do know is the experts are calling it safe and effective, therefore it must be safe and effective. Mm. And I think the problem with that is and I'm not trying to pick on her, but she must have some idea with what safe and effective means for it to have meaning for her.
Right.
So, and I guess this said something else that came to mind, or this brought something else to mind, and that is like the role of science in all this.
Mm.
And we've been told to follow the science and trust the science. We were told that Dr. Fauci is the science somehow. And people have been appealing to science, and there's science deniers out there. And something that seems to be getting missed, and I'm by no means the first to say this, Jordan Peterson talks about this. I think he even cites, I'm not sure it was Carl Jung or whoever, but science is good at telling us what is happening in the world,
Mm-hmm.
but it says nothing about what we should be doing or how we ought to act.
Right.
That is ultimately a moral thing that we need to kind of think about, that we need to, the science can tell us, for example, that, if a human body is submerged in cold water, that it could die fairly quickly, and science can tell us that this particular water is cold,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't tell us that whether or not we should erect a fence or have a lifeguard or put a warning sign up. Those are all policy things that we might do.
Things that we decide based on the evidence or the science.
Sure, yeah, the science tells us that this is dangerous.
Yeah.
But we have to decide maybe this body of water is far from all kinds of people, and it's not going to be expensive to put fences around every cold body of water in Canada.
Right.
Or maybe it's in an urban park where there are going to be a lot of people, and the expense is justified because it might save a few kids every few years, and that's worth the cost. Science doesn't tell us that exactly. It's, I guess, our values and our moral convictions and things like that. So the science tells us the water's cold, but it doesn't tell us whether or not we should put a fence up or a sign up. And I think that's what's been missing in this whole vaccine and mask mandates is the science. Yeah, the science doesn't really tell us how to act. It tells us what the universe is like. So I happened upon this article, and I'll put a link to it. It's not a very good article, frankly, but you can look at it if you'd like. And it's written by someone named Anna Drake. And I found this article, I can't remember exactly, I was searching for something on the trucker convoy. Anyway, it's down an internet rabbit hole. And on February 8th of 2022, like during the actual convoy, this is before the Emergencies Act was invoked, she wrote this article that was talking about how all the swastikas and all the Confederate flags and the white supremacy and the violence and just how horrible it was. And anyway, I guess in her byline on this, I noticed that she's a University of Waterloo professor. And so I kind of looked her up, and sure enough, she's a University of Waterloo professor. I think she's in political science. And she wrote a book recently called Activism, Inclusion, and the Challenges of Deliberative Democracy. And this ties into what we've been talking about here a little bit, I think. First of all, have you heard of deliberative democracy before?
Not until about 15 minutes ago when you said you were going to talk about it.
Yeah. I hadn't heard of it before. And it's funny, reading this, I read part of the introduction of her book and some other stuff she published online. She's clearly very academic, so I might be misunderstanding what she's getting at. She uses a lot of fancy words. Just as an aside, I kind of find that using fancy words and complexity, like at school, for example, that sometimes you're talking about complex topics that necessarily require complex language to articulate these complex thoughts. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of unavoidable.
Yep.
At the same time, I noticed that there are some academics who I think use all kinds of fancy and complicated language to dress up what is really a very plain and often kind of dumb idea kind of thing. And I think maybe that's what she's doing here. Mm-hmm. So deliberative democracy, as I understand it, is something that I think is pretty normative to our democracy. That's the idea that we deliberate, that we discuss, that we have elected representatives that represent us, but then they, debate with one another They listen to experts. They ask citizens their opinion. And this happens at all levels of government. Like you think at a municipal level, maybe there's a citizens coalition that wants to talk about whether there should be a stop sign at Main and Elm Street, and council, although they ultimately get to vote on it, they often will listen or at least hear people out, hear the pros, hear the cons, and the idea is out of that discussion, I mean, in the best of worlds, a consensus will develop, but even short of that, our policymakers will get an idea of sort of what are the people,
concerns?
Yeah, what are the concerns? What are the issues? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny. It makes so much sense. I didn't know it had a name. I didn't know that it was a specific sort of flavor. Anyway, she is concerned about deliberative democracy, as I understand it. And what's funny is this book was written in 2021, so this is before the trucker convoy. And she talks about, so basically her view, as I understand it, is because there's systemic oppression in the world, because there's all this racism and power and patriarchy and that kind of thing, that has either infected deliberative democracy, or because deliberative democracy, in her view, emanates from all that oppression, that it's not legitimate, and that activism should somehow stand apart from deliberative democracy. It's kind of funny because she's talking about how great protests are and how good civil disobedience is, and yet she, when it comes, like after she published that book, when it was the trucker convoy, she had nothing but horrible things to say about the racist truckers who were...
Right. So you're only supposed to use civil disobedience and things like that if it's something she agrees with?
That's... you know what? Yeah, you obviously say that tongue-in-cheek, but yes, I think that's it. I think there's a certain flavor of activism. And the reason I bring this up, this is like an obscure, as far as I can tell, she's an obscure professor. She wrote a book. It's pretty academic, like lots of academic books. Like my instructors joke about this. Like you write an academic book and like 20 people read it. And that's kind of normative in these academic circles. But it elucidated something to me, and that something that keeps coming up, like when we're talking to the counter-protesters at the trucker convoy, while some of them engaged, which I appreciate, many of them did not want to talk to me. They did not want to talk to the other side. Like they're protesting, you put a microphone in front of them and a camera and say, tell me why you're here, and they refuse to debate. And that sort of struck me as strange, because I think we're to deliberate, we're to discuss. And I'm not saying that they're reading her book, but I think there's something afoot. There's some sort of movement that is saying that this idea of speaking amongst yourselves, debating, I mean, use the example of parliament. I don't know the exact etymology of that word, but I think it comes from the same root as the French word, parler.
Yep.
To speak, a parlor is where we speak, parliament is where we discuss and debate. It's about talking.
Yep.
Is it because talking is so good at solving things? Sometimes, but it's sort of, if we don't talk, what else do we have?
Right.
I guess.
And that's a value that we have, or we seem to have had in our society. Like in Canada, we kind of, I'd say in general, we kind of pride ourselves on being able to think and discuss openly about things instead of taking up our swords and our and going at it in the streets. We value this as a way of working through things that we disagree on, or things that what's the direction of our country, what are our goals, what are our, how do we want our school systems to run. All of these things are things that we talk about, and it seems to have been a value for us as Canadians, and yet recently it seems like there's a lot of things that just are not allowed to be talked about, which I disagree with. I mean, I know that we've talked about this before about Trump being his profile being taken down from Twitter.
Yeah. Which I think just got reinstated.
Just got reinstated, yes. I am not a big Trump fan.
Yeah.
I I think
so if you're not a fan, then he shouldn't be on Twitter, right?
quite the opposite.
So if you think he's on Twitter, it means you love him and everything he stands for?
No. I believe in free speech. I believe that even the dumbest ideas, even the most racist of people, even, I don't know. I just think everyone should have the equal opportunity to say their dumb thing.
Yeah.
And that the rest of us that are listening and watching, it's up to us to filter through the crap and to believe what we think is right. And obviously if Trump says something stupid, I'm not going to post an encouraging word on it. I'm going to either ignore it or, I probably would mostly ignore. I don't think I watched any of his tweets ever, but I just think he has a right to be there. And I feel the same way about lots of things. I think we have to be allowed to talk about, things that are going to offend people, because all people are different. Frankly, some of the books we have, in our libraries for kids these days about transgender and things like that, some of those things offend me. But it's not popular to talk about that because it might offend somebody else. So it's very hard to, who gets to decide what's offensive and what's not, and what's allowed to be talked about and what's not. And frankly, I don't believe there's anyone I trust to be able to make that decision, and therefore we have to let I believe that all those voices need to be allowed to be spoken and heard.
What if the government set up a special commission, call it the CRTC, that would look at things online behind closed doors and then just serve you the things that it deems is good? How would you feel? That way you don't have to look at all the stuff that's... and there is a lot of horrible stuff online.
Frankly, there's a lot there I don't want to see.
In fact, most of it. Yes,
there's a lot of crap out there. I can see how some people might like that, because if that person or committee were perfect, they would easily weed out all of the things that are absolutely wrong and keep them from our eyes. The problem is that humans are not perfect, and there's no one person or one group of people. We elect governments all the time. I can't think of one government we've ever elected that was perfect. Can you?
Nope.
No. So even though I may
They're
have...
all imperfect to different
degrees, right? Even the governments I voted in, if they got in, have not always done what I wanted them to do or would have believed to be the right thing. So I don't believe that there's a person or a group out there who would be able to make those calls and not...
Yeah. And even if there was someone who was perfect or close to perfect, it would not only, maybe depending on how you define perfect, would have to know what is good and bad in terms of what to allow. But that person would have to be absolutely incorruptible, because that position would have so much power that it could set the narrative. So what if you did get someone who was malevolent in that position? How would we ever know? Because that person or those people would be controlling the narrative.
Right.
And even if that person was good at figuring out what was good to be allowed and what wasn't, and let's suppose somehow they were incorruptible, they would have to be near all powerful as well, because there are corrupt people who would see that position and would wield power to get rid of that righteous, incorruptible person and
try to get their own person in there.
So it's a pretty tall order if you're looking for someone who has perfect judgment to know what should go out, what should not go out, is perfectly incorruptible, and also is sufficiently more powerful than anyone else that would unseat them. That's
it's just not possible.
Yeah, not in this world, I don't think.
No.
Anyway, so that one other thing, we'll close with this, and that's the Public Order Emergency Commission. And I'm not sure, have you been following that
Only
Those-
snippets
yeah.
that I see on like Rebel News and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, it's this last week, someone, I wish I could remember who it was. Someone gave a pretty good overview of the story so far. It might have been True North recently. I apologize, but at a broad level, it seems that they've talked to all the different police agencies. None of them seemed, although they acknowledge it was helpful,
Right.
none of them asked for it explicitly, nor felt it was necessary.
Right.
CSIS, Canada's intelligence network, they didn't think these were terrorists or anywhere near that threshold.
Yeah.
We had, I guess, acting chief of police Steve Bell of the Ottawa Police Services said that there was, well, first he said there was violence, and then when questioned, there was more like a feeling of violence than actual violence.
Right.
And then Trudeau's security advisor, I think her name is Thomas, Jody Thomas, I might have that wrong, Thompson Thomas. She basically felt that maybe things could get violent or out of control, but she's a civil servant, as I understand it. So something that's interesting in this, it kind of opens up kind of how our system works, and I think frankly, Trudeau has maybe kicked over a hornet's nest here, because I think, and we've talked about this, going to the trucker convoy, the sort of people, you see a diversity of people there, but it is fair to say that in general, they are, or we are, I guess, because we're part of that, more on the working class end of things, mm-hmm. Generally less sophisticated, generally less educated, perhaps less articulate, but still good people. Mm-hmm. Frankly, I think a lot of them, I'll speak for myself, that this whole thing has kind of woken a lot of people up. Mm-hmm. There's, in the media, they talk about how this trucker movement was trying to overthrow the government, as evidenced by this memo where they're calling on the Governor General to dissolve Parliament. I'm not sure. I think more people know who the Governor General is and
yep.
what
more
cabinet
people,
is versus Parliament. And,
yep.
Yeah.
I was going to say, in the last year, in my entire I'm 41 years old this year. In my 40 years of life, I don't think I'd ever written to an MP before last year, and I wrote to every single one of them last year, and I figured out who was who, and I went and made sure I signed petitions, and and that was the thing about, you mentioned about these people who want to overthrow the government. Well, first of all, I don't think that's what they were trying to do, but if overthrowing the government means they want something to be done, okay, then maybe that's true. But frankly, even if they did want to overthrow the government and the big threat was that they're writing letters to the Governor General, who cares? They're writing letters, they're not being violent, they're using their freedoms that we recognize here in Canada, their freedom of peaceful protest, their freedom to write letters and communicate with their MPPs and things, to maybe their request is not one that it's not one that the Governor General can fulfill, but
and so they're trying something. Yeah,
they're trying something to make change in their world, and
I think
that's great.
Yeah, I think there's an awakening where a lot of people, when things are working reasonably well, mm-hmm. you don't question it,
right?
And you live in ignorance, and as long as they're plowing the roads and things are kind of working, you don't care the distinction between the Senate versus the House of Commons and what cabinet is versus Parliament, and how different police forces have different jurisdictions under different, none of that really bothers you until things kind of go wrong. I think a lot of people are waking up saying okay, what is this Emergencies Act? What do you need to invoke it? Who said what to whom, and who gets to decide that, and what's the definition of a threat? Well, it turns out we have this legal system, which is complicated and wordy and often dry, but it's there, and it's something we've inherited, and I think people are starting to pay more attention to that, which I think is only to the good. Mm-hmm. Well, Janet, what do you say we leave it there unless you have anything else to add at the end?
I think that's great.
Well, guys, thanks for watching. Do leave your comments. Just on the comments, and when I talked about Bibi Burns, I do want to make this a channel where people can disagree, where we can have a discourse, we can have a dialogue. I want to make it something where if maybe you agree with me, but you've got a friend or a family member who doesn't, and if you think we're doing a good job articulating some of the things that perhaps you can't or don't feel comfortable doing, please share that with people who you think might benefit. And if you're listening because you're one of those people who found this channel because someone brought you here and you disagree with me, that's cool, you're welcome. Make some comments, challenge our thinking. We certainly don't have all the answers, but we want to work through this honestly to get a better sense of what's going on. So until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you later.